Neville Goddard had a method that almost nobody who teaches his work will explain to you, not because it is hidden in an obscure text, not because it requires advanced study to find, but because explaining it honestly would undermine the entire industry that has been built around his teachings. The method is silence, specifically the total, deliberate, non-negotiable silence about your desired financial state. Not as a spiritual protection strategy, not as an energy management technique, as a neurological necessity. Because every single time you verbalize what you want to manifest, every single time you tell someone your financial intentions, your nervous system receives a signal that is biologically indistinguishable from a direct statement of lack. And that signal is not cancelled by the spiritual intention behind the words. It is accepted, encoded, and used to build a neural architecture that will generate more of exactly what the words described. Not the money, the wanting of the money, not the having, the gap. Neville never taught you to share your vision. Read every lecture, read every book. Search for the teaching where he instructs you to tell your friends what you are manifesting, to post your intentions publicly, to find an accountability partner for your assumption work. You will not find it, because he never said it. What he said was, go within, close the door, work in the inner world, impress the subconscious in the privacy of your own imagination. His entire framework was explicitly and consistently interior. And the reason is not mystical. The reason is neurological. The subconscious receives its most powerful impressions from the most consistently generated signals. And every time you speak the language of wanting, of not yet having, of working toward, you are generating that signal with the full neurological weight of motor output, auditory processing, emotional response, and social context, all firing simultaneously. That combined signal is one of the most potent encoding mechanisms available to the human nervous system. And if what it is encoding is the gap between where you are and where you want to be, the subconscious will build an architecture around that gap and keep you living in it indefinitely. Think about the specific emotional state that accompanies the act of sharing a manifestation goal with someone else. There is anticipation in it. There is the hope that they will affirm it. There is sometimes a subtle need for external validation, that the goal is reasonable, achievable, worth pursuing, and underlying all of that is the clear consciousness of not yet. The goal is being shared because it has not happened. If it had already happened, you would not be sharing it as a goal. You would be sharing it as a fact. And that distinction, goal versus fact, wanting versus having, is exactly the distinction your nervous system registers every time the words come out. You are not accidentally encoding the wrong thing. You are deliberately, enthusiastically, sometimes publicly encoding the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And the law, which does not evaluate your spiritual intentions, delivers exactly what that encoding contains. The spiritual community has built an entire culture around verbalizing desires, and that culture is producing exactly the results you would expect from a culture dedicated to encoding lack. Scripting, vision boards, public declarations of intention, accountability, partners for manifestation goals, social media posts about what you are calling in. All of these are presented as powerful manifestation tools, and all of them, without exception, are rooted in the consciousness of wanting rather than having. They are rooted in the state of someone who does not yet have the thing. The scripting exercise where you write about your desired financial reality as if it has happened is an attempt to simulate the having state. But the fact that it is an exercise, a deliberate simulation, means the nervous system registers it as a performance rather than a reality. And immediately after the exercise, the practitioner goes back to their actual life in which the thing has not happened, and they talk to people about the thing they are working on manifesting. And the nervous system, which weights habitual behavior far more heavily than occasional practice, receives the consistent signal. The thing is not yet real. The lack is the actual state. The silence of people who consistently manifest significant money is not a spiritual practice they adopted because someone told them to keep their energy protected. It is the natural behavior of a consciousness that has genuinely assumed. When you truly assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, when your nervous system has actually accepted the desired state as the current reality rather than the future goal, you stop talking about it as a goal. Not because you are hiding it, because the context in which you would talk about it, The context of wanting, of not yet, of working toward it, no longer matches your inner state. The inner state has already moved past wanting into having. And you do not have conversations about things you already have in the same way you have conversations about things you are still trying to get. The grammar changes. The emotional tone changes. The entire nature of the communication changes. And often, the communication simply does not happen because the goal framing is gone and the fact framing has not yet been confirmed by the physical world. So the person operating from genuine assumption simply moves through their life without discussing it. And that silence is not discipline. It is the organic expression of a consciousness that has genuinely left the wanting state behind. Most people will read this and conclude that the instruction is to stop talking about their manifestation goals, and they will attempt to implement that as a behavioral rule. They will white-knuckle through the urge to share their vision. They will practice keeping their intentions private as a spiritual discipline, and within weeks or months, the impulse will break through anyway, because the underlying consciousness has not changed. The wanting consciousness wants to verbalize, it wants external validation, it wants to process the gap between current and desired state through conversation. And suppressing the verbalization without changing the consciousness produces nothing except additional frustration. This is the same error as trying to force indifference without building genuine assumption. You cannot behave your way into the right consciousness. You can only build the right consciousness and let the behavior follow naturally. What Neville was pointing at with his emphasis on the inner work is exactly this. Build the assumption in the inner world, in the imaginal, in the felt sense of already having, so completely and so consistently that the outer behavior changes as a consequence. When the assumption is genuine, the silence is automatic. You do not need to discipline yourself into keeping quiet about your financial manifestation. You are simply not in the framing anymore where there is anything to declare. The conversation has already happened internally between your conscious and subconscious mind. The impression has been made. The work is done. And the silence of the Sabbath, the rest that Neville described as the condition following genuine impression, is not a practice you maintain. It is a state you inhabit. The specific neurological mechanism that makes verbalization so damaging to an active assumption is worth understanding precisely. When you speak, you are not simply producing sound. You are engaging a broad neurological network that includes motor planning, auditory processing, emotional response, social cognition, and memory encoding. All of those systems are active simultaneously when you verbalize a desire, and all of them receive the same content. The thing is not yet mine. I want this. I am working toward this. I am calling this in. Each repetition through that network strengthens the neural architecture associated with the wanting state. And the wanting state, as we have established in detail, is the opposite of the state that produces the physical manifestation. Every conversation about what you are trying to manifest is a neurological reinforcement of trying rather than having, of wanting rather than being, of the gap rather than the arrival. And those reinforcements compound, exactly the way all neural reinforcement compounds, until the wanting consciousness is the dominant operating system and the assumption has no structural foundation left to stand on. Before we go further, check the pinned comment below this video. What is there is directly connected to the second half of this, and it will give you something concrete to work with immediately. There is a related phenomenon that is equally damaging and almost never discussed in the Neville community. It is the inner verbalization, the internal monologue about the desired state that runs as a form of affirmation rather than a genuine assumption. The person who lies in bed at night telling themselves, "I am wealthy, I am abundant, money flows to me easily," while their nervous system registers the gap between those statements and the lived reality. This is affirmation in the traditional sense, and Neville was careful to distinguish his work from traditional affirmation practice for exactly this reason. An affirmation stated in the present tense is not the same as an assumption felt from the inside. I am wealthy is a statement. The felt sense of already being wealthy is a state, and the nervous system does not respond to statements, it responds to states. The statement I am wealthy, when it is experienced against the backdrop of a lived reality that contradicts it, is not an assumption. It is a lie that the conscious mind is telling the subconscious, and the subconscious, which is far more intelligent than most people credit it with being, recognizes the lie. It registers the emotional incongruity between the words and the underlying state. And it encodes the underlying state, not the words, because the underlying state is what is actually being felt, and feeling is the language the subconscious actually speaks. This is why Neville consistently directed people away from affirmation and toward imaginal scenes. He was not making an arbitrary distinction between two similar practices. He was pointing at the fundamental neurological difference between a statement and a state. A scene imagined with enough sensory and emotional detail that it feels real is not an affirmation. It is a brief experience. And brief experiences, repeated with enough consistency and emotional intensity at the right threshold of consciousness, can genuinely shift the ground state. Because the subconscious does not distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a physically real one at the level of encoding. Both register as data points, both contribute to the neural architecture. A well-executed imaginal scene adds structure to the assuming consciousness. A well-executed affirmation, one that does not actually feel real, adds structure to the wanting consciousness, because the wanting is what is actually felt beneath the words. The silence, then, is not about withholding information from other people. It is about ceasing to generate in any form the signal of wanting. It is about stopping the continuous broadcast of the gap, stopping the inner monologue that phrases the desire in terms of not yet, stopping the conversations that encode the goal rather than the reality, and replacing all of that not with forced silence, but with the natural quiet of a consciousness that has genuinely moved past wanting into having. The person in genuine assumption is not silent because they are hiding something. They are silent because there is nothing to declare. The wanting has been replaced by being. The goal has been replaced by the ground state. And you do not make declarations about your ground state the way you make declarations about your aspirations. You simply inhabit it, quietly, completely, without announcement. The old money principle that surfaces in every culture that has produced multi-generational wealth is not coincidentally aligned with what Neville described about the silence of assumption. The old money families do not discuss their wealth in the context of wanting or acquiring. They discuss it in the context of having. When wealth is the ground state, the conversation around it is different. It is not the conversation of someone building towards something. It is the conversation of someone for whom the thing is simply the background of life. And that conversational tone, that specific quality of treating abundance as unremarkable, as simply the way things are, is neurologically indistinguishable from what Neville described as living in the end. It is the outer expression of an inner state that has accepted abundance as the baseline reality, and the silence about money, the specific silence that characterizes people whose relationship to wealth is the most stable and the most enduring, is the silence of someone for whom there is nothing left to want in that domain, nothing left to declare, nothing left to call in, because the having is already complete, at the level where their nervous system operates. This is the piece of Neville's teaching that the manifestation industry has the most commercial incentive to obscure, because the silence method requires nothing to be purchased, nothing to be joined, nothing to be maintained through regular participation in a community or a program. It requires only the inner work. The private, unseen, unannounced work of building an assumption so solid that the wanting language simply falls away. It requires no accountability partner and no public declaration and no weekly check-in about your manifestation progress. It requires the opposite of all of those things. It requires the complete withdrawal from the culture of wanting out loud and the complete commitment to the culture of having in silence. And that withdrawal is not comfortable for a culture that has built its social and psychological infrastructure around the shared pursuit of things not yet obtained. But it is exactly what Neville described, and it is exactly what the nervous system requires in order to shift the ground state from wanting to having. The silence is not a rule. It is the evidence that the shift has been made. The practical implications of this extend further than most people initially realize, because the verbalization problem is not limited to conversations with other people. It includes every inner monologue that frames the desired state as something you do not yet have. Every thought that begins with "I need" or "I want" or "I am trying to" or "I am working on" is a verbalization of the wanting state. Every mental rehearsal of how you will feel when the money arrives is a mental acknowledgement that it has not yet arrived. Every time you imagine telling someone about your manifestation after it happens, while it has not yet happened, you are running the wanting consciousness in an imaginal context. The subconscious does not distinguish between an imaginal wanting and a spoken wanting. Both register as the same signal. And the signal is always the same. The gap is real. The thing is not yet mine. Neville's distinction between imagination used correctly and imagination used incorrectly is rooted in exactly this. He described two types of imaginal activity. One is the imaginal act performed from inside the desired state, living in the end, occupying the scene from a first-person perspective as if the thing is already real. The other is the imaginal activity of someone who is still outside the desired state, looking at it from the outside, imagining what it will be like when it happens. The first type impresses the having state on the subconscious. The second type impresses the not yet state, and the difference between them is entirely about the inner position from which the imagining is done, inside or outside, already or eventually. The silence of genuine assumption is the natural result of having moved completely inside the desired state. There is nothing to announce from inside. There is no gap to describe. There is only the quiet fullness of already being there. The Japanese concept of quiet wealth, which has generated substantial cultural fascination in recent years, is fundamentally a description of this neurological state as it manifests in behavior and social presentation. The quiet, wealthy person does not announce wealth, does not discuss acquiring it, does not signal the pursuit of it. This behavior is often described as cultural modesty or aristocratic reserve, but those are surface-level descriptions of a deeper, functional reality. The quiet, wealthy person has, through whatever path brought them to that condition, a nervous system whose relationship to abundance is settled. It is not aspirational. It is not active. It is complete. And completeness does not announce itself. It simply is. The silence is not performed. It is the natural outer expression of an inner state that has nothing left to want in the financial domain, because the having is already the baseline. What Neville understood, and what this cultural pattern confirms from a completely different angle, is that the relationship between consciousness and wealth is always and only an inside job. The outer behavior, the silence, the ease, the absence of the telling people about my goals energy is the effect. The cause is the inner state of having rather than wanting, of being rather than pursuing, of rest rather than vigilance. And you cannot produce the outer behavior through imitation and expect to generate the inner state as a result. You cannot practice being quietly wealthy and thereby become quietly wealthy. You can only build the inner architecture that produces quiet wealth as its natural expression. And that architecture is built exactly the way Neville described, through the inner imaginal work, through the felt sense of already being in the desired reality, through sats and revision and living in the end, through the persistent, private, unannounced inhabitation of the state you want your life to express, through silence, not as a rule but as the inevitable consequence of having genuinely made the assumption. The culture of sharing your manifestation journey, of posting about what you are calling in, of finding community around your financial goals, feels supportive. It feels like momentum, it feels like accountability, and at the level of the conscious mind, it might even provide those things briefly. But at the level of the subconscious, at the level where the actual creative work happens, it is continuous encoding of the gap. Every post about what you are manifesting is a public affirmation that you do not yet have it. Every conversation about your financial goals is a social reinforcement of the wanting state. Every accountability partner who checks in on your progress is a regular reminder that the progress is still in progress. And the subconscious, receiving all of that input with the same neutral accuracy it applies to everything, builds a neural architecture around the consistent signal. The thing is not yet real. The wanting is the dominant state. The lack is the operating system. Stop talking about what you want to manifest, not as a spiritual discipline you maintain through willpower, but as the natural consequence of building the inner state until there is nothing left in the wanting framing to say. Stop the inner monologue that frames your desired financial state as future. Stop the rehearsal of how you will feel when it arrives. Stop the conversations that process the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And replace all of that, not with silence as a practice, but with the inner work that makes silence natural. Build the assumption, build it in the imaginal, build it at the hypnagogic threshold, build it through revision of the memories that support the wanting architecture. Build it until the wanting framing simply does not fit anymore, until the money is not a goal, but a ground state. Until the silence is not something you maintain, but something you inhabit. Because that is the silence Neville was describing when he talked about the Sabbath. That is the silence that precedes manifestation. That is the silence that is not the absence of wanting, but the presence of having. The specific instruction that Neville gave, the one that most people read and move past without fully absorbing, was to occupy the feeling of the wish fulfilled as if it were your current reality, not your future one. As if. Not in the performance sense, in the neurological sense. As if means from inside. As if means the inner reference point is the fulfilled state, not the current physical state. As if means the conversation you have with yourself and the world is the conversation of someone for whom the thing is already real, not someone for whom it is still ahead. And that as if, genuinely inhabited rather than performed, produces the silence automatically. Because from inside the fulfilled state, the vocabulary of wanting does not apply. There is nothing to announce, nothing to declare, nothing to share as a goal. There is only the quiet, natural, unremarkable fact of already being there. And that fact does not require discussion. It does not require a community to validate it. It does not require signs from the universe to confirm it. It simply is, silently, completely, real. If this changed the way you understand why the spiritual community's culture of sharing and declaring and announcing has been working against the very thing it is supposed to support, leave a comment below and be specific about where the shift happened for you. The most valuable comments in this community are the ones where someone describes in precise terms the exact moment something reorganized for them. That specificity is what transfers across the screen and produces the same shift in someone else. And if you know someone who is deep in the scripting and vision board culture and wondering why it is not working, share this with them. Not as criticism of their practice, as an explanation of the mechanism that changes everything. There is a dimension of this silence principle that connects directly to how Neville described the relationship between the conscious mind and the subconscious. He described the conscious mind as the gardener and the subconscious as the soil. The gardener plants seeds in the soil. The soil does not debate the seed. It does not evaluate whether the seed deserves to grow. It simply grows what is planted. This is one of the most frequently quoted metaphors from Neville's work, but most people miss the implication that is most relevant to what we are discussing. If the conscious mind is the gardener, then the things the conscious mind repeatedly generates, whether in speech, in thought, in emotional tone, are all seeds being planted. And the question is not which seeds you intend to plant. The question is which seeds you actually plant through your habitual activity. The person who plants abundance seeds during a 20-minute practice and spends the rest of the day planting wanting seeds through their speech and their thoughts and their monitoring behavior, the soil receives both types of seeds, but not equally. The soil receives seeds in proportion to how consistently and how emotionally intensely they are planted. And if wanting is planted all day, and having is planted for 20 minutes, the ratio of what grows is predictable. The garden will produce primarily wanting, more of the state of not yet, more of the gap, because that is what was planted most. The silence is about changing the ratio, not through suppression, through replacement, through building the inner state of having so consistently and so genuinely that it becomes the primary seed being planted in the subconscious garden. Through making the habitual activity of the conscious mind, the background thoughts, the automatic responses, the quality of attention brought to daily life, a continuous expression of the having state rather than the wanting state. And when that shift actually happens, when the habitual activity of consciousness is genuinely anchored in having rather than wanting, the verbalization changes on its own, the inner monologue changes, the quality of thought changes, the emotional tone that pervades daily life changes, and the outer behavior, the conversations, the social media, the sharing and declaring, all of that changes as well. Not because you enforced new rules, because the consciousness that was generating the old behavior has been replaced by a consciousness that simply does not produce it anymore. This is the full picture of what Neville meant by the new birth, not a metaphor for spiritual renewal in the conventional religious sense. The actual neurological replacement of a dominant inner state, the death of the wanting consciousness and the birth of the having consciousness. And it is recognizable not primarily by the physical changes in external circumstances, though those follow. It is recognizable first by the change in the inner conversation, the moment the inner monologue stops producing the language of wanting, the moment the assuming consciousness is so solid that the wanting framing genuinely no longer applies. That is the new birth. And everything that follows it materially is just the physical world expressing what has already been established in consciousness. The people who have experienced this describe it in remarkably consistent terms across cultures and traditions and languages, a specific quality of quiet, an absence of urgency around the previously urgent desire, a sense that the question has been settled even before the physical answer has arrived. And crucially, a cessation of the need to discuss it. The wanting language simply does not arise, not because they suppressed it, because it does not fit. The inner state has moved past the frame in which that language lives, and from that new position, the silence is not an achievement. It is simply the natural condition of a consciousness that has genuinely assumed, of a subconscious that has genuinely accepted the impression, of a nervous system that is no longer running the searching program because the search has been internally resolved. The money follows, not as a reward for the silence, not because the universe is responding to your energetic discipline, but because the consciousness that is no longer searching for money, no longer encoding the gap between current and desired, no longer broadcasting the wanting signal, is a consciousness of having. And a consciousness of having, as Neville said without qualification or exception, externalizes itself into a life that reflects that having. The silence is not the cause of the manifestation. The inner state that produces the silence is the cause of the manifestation. The silence is just the most visible outer symptom of the inner shift that makes everything else possible. And when you see it in yourself, when you notice that the urge to share, to declare, to discuss your financial intentions has genuinely quieted, not because you suppressed it, but because it no longer has the urgency it once did, that is your nervous system signaling that the ground state has shifted. That is the Sabbath. That is the rest. That is the point from which Neville said all things become possible, not eventually, but now, because the consciousness has accepted them as already real, and from that acceptance, the physical world has no meaningful resistance left to offer. So the silence method is not a technique you add to your practice. It is the evidence that the practice has worked. It is the behavioral expression of a consciousness that has genuinely made the transition from wanting to having, from pursuing to possessing, from hoping to knowing. And if you're not yet experiencing that silence naturally, if the urge to share and declare and discuss is still strong, that is not a sign of failure. It is information. It is the nervous system accurately reporting that the ground state has not yet shifted, that the wanting consciousness is still the dominant operating system, and that information points you directly to what needs more work, not more silence as a practice, more depth in the inner assumption, more consistency in the imaginal work, more genuine inhabitation of the having state until the wanting state simply no longer fits, until the silence is not something you maintain, until it is something you are.